Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look at using multiple timers in your application. Today we're going to be looking at timers on a form. So let's first of all look at the form itself. If we go into the Forms Designer, we can see we have a fairly simple form here. There is one button, which is an exit button. There is a large text box, and there are two fields which are labels. These two label fields we're going to be updating, and we're going to be updating them triggered by timers. If we look at the label fields themselves, you'll see that I have used a larger font and the colour has been changed for the foreground. This is to make them easier to see. So why would you want to use a timer on a form? Timers can be very useful to trigger events at certain points in time. You may have some event you wish to happen every 30 seconds, and a timer is one of the mechanisms you can use to actually action something at a predetermined point in time. So let's have a look at the code. If we go to our callback function, which is the event handler for the form, we will see in here there are a number of events already set up for you. There is the initialize dialog event, which is the first event that is triggered when a form is being loaded. This is even before the form is shown to the user. In here, we're going to create the call to our first timer. We're going to use one of the Windows API calls called setTimer. This function takes a number of parameters. The first parameter is the dialog handle. The second parameter is the identifier of our timer, which we will set this constant up in a moment. The next parameter, currently sitting at 1000, is how often this timer will actually trigger. This is set in milliseconds, so 1000 milliseconds is a single second. So this timer is going to trigger every second. The final parameter we have here is byval null. This final parameter allows you to set the pointer to our callback function. Now we're not going to be using this one in here, we're just going to be using the callback function of the dialog itself. So we're just setting this one to the value of null. We will perhaps cover this final parameter in more detail in a later video. So we've set the first timer up. Let's create this constant now. We're going to be using two timers, so we're going to create two constants at the beginning of our application. I'm giving these two the arbitrary values of 2000 and 2001. If we now go back to our callback function, the next thing to look at is what happens when the timer actually triggers. We need an event set up to detect the triggering of that timer. So we're going to create a new event called WMTimer. And since we intend using more than one timer, we need a way of differentiating between which timer has actually been triggered, the first one or the second one. So we're going to use a select statement, testing on the cv.wparam. If the value coming back from that is timer 1, then it's timer 1 that's been triggered. So what I'd like to do when this is triggered is to update the field we have on the screen, which is going to contain the current time. So we could put the code that's going to do that directly into here, but I'm going to put it into a function just to show that you can call a function from a timer. We're going to call this function updateField, and it will take three parameters. The first parameter is of course the handle of the dialog. The second parameter is going to be the handle to the label we wish to update, and the final value is the string we wish to put into that object. In this case, we're using time $. So let's create that function now. There we have created our function with its three parameters, the dialog handle, the field we wish to update, and the value we want to put into that field. And we're going to use a very simple control set text command to update that on our dialog. Depending what you're actually using your timer for, this function could do many other things. One thing to remember though, that since this function is going to be triggered every second, the time taken by your function to run will have to be run in less than a second. So now that we've got that in place, let's try a compile just to make sure we haven't missed anything. And our program compiles quite successfully, so let's try running that now. There's our program running, and each second the label which is containing our time is being updated. The advantage of doing this on a timer is that this will run quite independently of what we're doing on the screen. So the timer's running while I'm typing stuff into the dialog. So now we've achieved one timer, what else do we need to do to handle the second timer? And once the form loads, is there anything else we need to do as well? So the first thing we will do is to put a dialog end command in on the event when the exit button is actually clicked. Since we've actually created a timer when the dialog is loaded, it's quite logical to kill the timer off at some point during the program or when the dialog ends. In this case, we want the timer to run for the entire duration that the form is on the screen, but once the form has actually been closed or is in the process of closing, we want to kill off the timer. So we can create another event in our event handler here to handle when the form is destroyed. This is the WM destroy event. And we can stop the timer from running and free up its resources by using another Windows API call called killTimer. It takes a mere 2 parameters, the dialog handle and the ID of our timer. So now that we have one timer running on screen, can we run a second timer quite independently of the first? As we've used the setTimer command to create our first timer, we're going to use setTimer again to create our second timer. And we're going to set this one to trigger every 5 seconds. So the only difference with the call to this function is we're using timer2 and our value is not 1000, it's 5000 this time because we want it to run every 5 seconds. So in our timer event, we'll need to add another case statement to handle the second timer. So what do we want this second timer to actually do? We want it to update the other label control. But rather than putting a time into it, we're going to put a piece of text. Every 5 seconds, I want it to work out whether the number of minutes is even or odd, and put that piece of text into the box. So we're going to create a couple local variables in our callback function. One to hold a number of minutes as a long, and one to hold a value as a string. We can pick up the number of minutes by converting the 2 right-hand characters from the time dollar into a number and storing that in long minutes. And we can use the mod command to work out whether the number is odd or even. The mod command will allow you to return the remainder after a division has occurred. So we're dividing long minutes by 2. If the remainder is 0, in other words, if the value is divisible by 2 with no remainder, then the value is considered to be even. Otherwise, the value will be considered as being odd. We can then use the function we created earlier to update the field, passing it the parameters of the label we wish to actually update and the value we wish to update it with. And just to remain tidy, we're going to kill that timer off when the form is destroyed. So if we run that code now, we will see the first timer is kicked in, and after 5 seconds, the text is updated, and every 5 seconds it will change to the other value. So it's alternately going to be odd and then even. So we now have 2 timers running on screen. And we can still type into the form without any irritating non-responding messages coming up at the top of a dialog. So our dialog is effectively doing 3 things. It's allowing us to type in to the text box. It's also updating the time on the screen every second, and every 5 seconds it's updating the text box underneath with either odd or even. So we've now used 2 timers within our form. However, you may not want your timer running for the entire duration of the form. So how do we stop one of the timers running partway through the sequence? Let's have a look at the code again. In our timer2 function, perhaps we only want to run this a certain number of times. So let's create a count variable to count out how many times it's actually been triggered. We're going to use this, and every time our second timer is triggered, we will up that by 1. So we're now incrementing the long count. We can now test the value of long count, and we can do something once it reaches some threshold. So when long count equals 2, we can now trigger something to end our timer. We can copy the code that kills the timer, and we can paste it straight in here. So once long count has actually reached 2, then we're going to kill off the timer. In order for this to work, we need to make the long count variable static. This will ensure that it will remember the value between calls to the callback function. So what should happen when we run this code is the timer will trigger every second, and the clock will be updated on screen. And since long count is currently 0, it will be updated to the value of 1. The text on screen will be updated to even, and then 5 seconds later it will be updated to the value of 2, and at that point it will not update the value from even to odd, so we should only see even appearing once. So we run the code now. We'll see our clock is running quite happily, and after 5 seconds the value has changed to even. Now in 5 seconds from then it should no longer run, because our second timer has been stopped, and it is indeed not updating. So you can use timers like this either to run for the entire duration of our form, or for a set period during the form's running. So what purpose could you find for timers within your application? They could be used by a user to determine how long a particular function the user has triggered has been running for. Or you could have them as a countdown timer, to count down the time until something is due to happen. The timers could also be used to work out whether the user has been active or not in the application. And once the countdown has reached 0, you could log the user out. And any activity within the form would reset your time. Hopefully you'll find this code useful in your applications. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.